It's time again for Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm managing editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined again by senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Hi, Peggy.
Hi, Dave.
We remind you about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a small donation, you can access all of the Tribune's faith coverage, ad-free podcast episodes, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's show. Mitt Romney may be the most famous Mormon politician, but the title of highest-ranking elected Latter-day Saint in U.S. history belongs not to a rich Utah Republican with a patrician background and deep ties in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but rather to a self-made Nevada Democrat with hardscrabble roots who converted to the faith. His name? Harry Reid. Passionately partisan, fiercely loyal, and discreetly devout, Reid, who died in 2021, rose to majority leader in the U.S. Senate, where the one-time boxer fought for landmark Democratic victories on Obamacare, financial reforms, and an economic stimulus package. He was ruthless and religious, LBJ without the swearing. To help us learn more about the real Harry Reid, we welcome political journalist Jon Ralston, author of the recently released biography, The Game Changer, How Harry Reid Remade the Rules and Showed Democrats How to Fight. Jon, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you here. Okay, so tell us about Harry Reid. He was born in Searchlight, Nevada. How did that tiny town, which pops up a lot in your book, shape him?
I think he was forged a lot by his early years in Searchlight and then in another town by the name of Henderson, which was somewhat larger. But Searchlight, he lived in unimaginable poverty for most of us. He really grew up in a shack. That's not an exaggeration. Made out of railroad ties that were put together with creosote by his dad, who was very handy. And, there was no running water and the town, there was nothing there. Just a couple hundred people. There was no amenities of any kind, and he became tough because of that, I think. And he both loved and hated Searchlight. He named his PAC after Searchlight, the Searchlight Leadership Fund. He had a picture of that shack in his office on Capitol Hill. But he also said to me when I interviewed him for the book, I just wanted to get the hell out of Searchlight, and he did. And he was driven to do more than what that little town offered him. And of course he did.
Mm-hmm. So let's jump to, because our listeners will be curious about this. His mother was raised Mormon, you say, but the family wasn't religious. How did Harry Reid end up becoming a Latter-day Saint?
Yeah, and I didn't know this story. I knew Harry Reid pretty well. I covered him for about 40 years as a political journalist, but I had never known the origin story of his conversion to the LDS Church. His wife, Landra, was raised Jewish. And that caused some friction when they were dating. In fact, there's a very famous story about a supposed fist fight, and I don't think it was much of a fist fight between Harry Reid and Landra's dad. I think it was more a slip, but there were some pushing and shoving, at least, and that was a bone of contention. And he told Landra, "If you marry him, you're dead to me," and it was very, very hard for her and for him. And so when they got together and got married and eloped and went to Utah, they were influenced by some key LDS people. One was their landlord in the place that they lived, and there was a person that Landra got to know through her job. She had a job while Harry Reid was going to school. And essentially Reid, and there's one kind of epiphany that he had when he was going down to his basement abode and he saw the family, the Mormon family, having dinner and talking to each other, which is something he had never experienced. His mom and dad fought a lot, and there was even violence in that family. And so they started to learn about the LDS Church. And what Landra told me in an interview, which I thought was really interesting, is they decided they would both convert because they didn't want religion to be contentious in their life the way it had been when they were dating. And they both liked the precepts of the LDS Church. And so they converted.
So now Harry's father was an alcoholic, right?
He was.
And ended up taking his life, correct?
He committed
At age
suicide.
58 or something,
Yeah,
right?
Harry Reid was in his 30s when that happened. It was as much as he and his dad had a fraught relationship, that had a big impact on him. And later he would get involved in some suicide prevention legislation. And so that was a searing experience for him.
So tell us a little bit about Landra and his love affair with her.
It's really, Harry Reid had some rough edges, as you alluded to in your intro, Dave, but this is a true love story. And it's 62 years. They met when they were 19 years old in high school. And you see how he talked about her and she talked about him, but even more about people who were close to them talked about them. Chuck Schumer, Reid's colleague who succeeded him, said the only time he ever saw Reid really distressed was when Landra was in a car accident and he saw tears streaming down Reid's face. And, Reid was never a person to show those kinds of emotions to anybody. But they adored each other. And one of his staffers said to me, you could see it when one or the other walked into a room, their faces would light up. And this is after decades and decades of marriage. And that was true until the end. When I interviewed Reid, I started interviewing him in the spring of 2021, which was only unfortunately 6 months before he passed away. And I did 24 Zoom interviews with him. And Landra was there for every one of them, sitting right next to the camera and occasionally correcting him or inserting details. And she granted me 3 interviews after he passed away and really filled in gaps that nobody else could have about what he was really like, why he did certain things, why he didn't do certain things. They were really, really an amazing couple. And she was a huge, huge influence in his life, more than even I knew when I was covering him. She was involved in political decisions as well, which I did not really know that much about. And I found in his archive documentation of meetings that she was in and advice that she gave.
She was like a key political advisor to him, right?
Yeah, and I was very surprised to learn that. And I thought I knew who all his political advisors were. And I knew Landra was smart. She was a very, very smart woman, but I did not know that she provided him counsel. And I tell a story in the book is how much she influenced him perhaps to vote against Clarence Thomas being confirmed to the U.S. Supreme Court. There was a speech that I found in the archive that Reid was going to give in favor of Clarence Thomas, and he changed his mind. And I asked Landra how that happened, and he said he trusted me because I watched every hearing. He didn't watch any of it because he was doing his duties as the Democratic leader, and so he listened to me. And I told him I believed in Anita Hill, if you remember all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So what were his ties to the infamous Howard Hughes and the so-called Mormon mafia?
So this is another thing that was revelatory to me that I didn't know much about. Harry Reid was the lieutenant governor to a guy by the name of Mike O'Callaghan, who was his mentor in high school and probably the second most influential person in his life after Landra. And so Reid and was not just your ordinary lieutenant governor. They don't run as a ticket in Nevada, but they were very, very close. And so he was essentially an extension of O'Callaghan. And when O'Callaghan became governor, Howard Hughes had this empire on the Las Vegas Strip, I think 7 casinos, something like that. But Paul Laxalt, the previous governor, had been very lax with bringing Hughes in person before the gaming regulators to get licensed. And he went to Reid and said, I trust you. I want you to go find out what his health really is like. Can he really supervise this? And so what Reid did is he traveled to Utah, to California, and other places in Nevada, found members of the so-called Mormon mafia who were surrounded Hughes, were kind of his palace guard. And he interviewed them and kept detailed notes on legal pads, which was Reid's signature way to keep notes about anything throughout his entire life. And I found these notes, and they were incredibly descriptive, and they eventually led O'Callaghan to having a meeting with Hughes in London, of all places, in which he decided for himself that Hughes was sound of mind and body enough, at least, even though he was somewhat frail already by then.
And quite eccentric and different things that we've all read about.
Right,
you know,
and Reid brought a lot of those details to life and got a lot out of this Mormon mafia that surrounded you.
Now, he made an initial bid for the Senate fairly early on in his political career, and he eventually became chair of the Nevada Gaming Commission. Okay, Nevada politics. It's pretty hard, especially Southern Nevada, probably hard to escape gaming and casinos, right? What were his ties to casinos and reputed mob bosses?
So he became a chairman of the Gaming Commission. You mentioned the early run for the Senate in 1974 against Paul Laxalt. He lost in a race he should have won, and he actually blew that race with a campaign blunder at the end.
He was a pretty sore loser after he lost.
He was a sore loser after he lost, but then he decided a smart move would be to run for Las Vegas mayor 6 months later, and he lost again. And essentially everyone gave him up for dead. He would never be seen again in the political scene in Nevada. But O'Callaghan resurrected him by appointing him chairman of the Gaming Commission, which was the body and still is that oversees casinos in Nevada. O'Callaghan wanted him because for two reasons. One, he was very tough, and two, O'Callaghan knew he could trust him implicitly. As I said earlier, they were very close. And the mob was still in Vegas at that time. And there's a very famous confrontation that is on video and was immortalized in the movie Casino between Reid and a guy by the name of Frank Lefty Rosenthal, who was the mob's guy at the Stardust Casino. And Reid really essentially made sure that Rosenthal was booted from the industry. It was seen as a landmark move. But Reid also was seen as going soft on some other people who were represented by a good friend of his. And that prompted the FBI to begin investigating him in the late 70s. And that went on much longer than anybody knew, including myself. But again, documents that I found in the archive, Reid requested his own FBI files, and I found them in the archive. They were heavily redacted, but there was enough in there to show they really wanted to get him. And they were investigating him well into his term in the House before he ran for the Senate. And so he was both a guy who helped get rid of the mob, but was also suspected of being the mob because he was heard on a wiretap, a couple of mobsters in Kansas City talking about, we got a clean face in our pocket.
Referring to him.
Referring to Reid, who was known to have this pristine reputation up until that point.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, did Reid ever gamble?
No, he did not. Okay. He did not. Not to my knowledge, at least.
How did he view, Latter-day Saint leaders are very, very down on, of course, gaming and gambling. How did he view the practice of casinos and gambling and all that?
So as you probably know, the church actually put out more than one statement against gambling, which most politicians, I think, have this ability, and other human beings do too, to compartmentalize, mm-hmm. right? Reid was a master at compartmentalization, right? And so gaming is the biggest industry in Nevada. You had to deal with these people. They gave a lot of money to campaigns, and Reid saw himself as a protector of the industry, even though he wasn't a guy who you could find at the craps table. He was a guy who wanted to make sure that these casinos remained vibrant, because they were, without the casinos, then the Nevada would dry up. And so he somehow managed to reconcile the church's opposition to gambling with supporting people who actually made money from gambling.
Mormon Land will be right back.
So let's talk a little bit about his Mormonism, which played a big role in his life privately. He always had a temple recommend and regularly attended general conference. How, though, did he showcase it publicly? Did he?
He really didn't. But privately, as you mentioned, he was much more devout than I realized. Taught Sunday school. He and Landra read scripture together in the evenings. Harry Reid was not on the party circuit in D.C. He was a real homebody. He and Landra stayed together, and they talked about the church, and they talked about scripture. But it did affect him in the sense that he was pro-life throughout his career. And you think about how weird this is, a pro-life guy being a leader of the Democratic Party. And so he knew that would be a difficult needle to thread. And again, talking about how you can compartmentalize. And there were some very, very pro-choice women in that caucus, Barbara Boxer and Patty Murray and others. And I interviewed them for the book. And they said that he always gave them the space for their issues. Like they knew he was going to vote against certain things, but that he wasn't going to prevent them from bringing their issues to the floor of the U.S. Senate. And so he was a very religious man. Now, I think this is kind of interesting with any politician, if I may, that religion plays such a big part in their life, and they're very devout. And yet Reid was a very ruthless guy who stepped over people, who was not kind to people all the time, including myself, by the way. But then, so how you reconcile the tenets of the Mormon Church with doing some of the things that he did, I think that was, again, masterful and a masterclass in compartmentalization.
Yeah, let's talk about some of those issues again, and including on abortion again. I mean, it seems like he'd have a hard time passing any kind of purity test on that now in the Democratic Party. But what were his positions on let's say, abortion, gun control, immigration, and how did they, if they did, and I know they did, evolve over time?
Yeah, his position on abortion really didn't change, and he voted against a lot of things that the rest of the Democratic caucus voted for in general. But on gun control and immigration, he changed a lot. Nevada, obviously, a Western state has a lot of pro-gun libertarian streak. And Reid was a favorite of the National Rifle Association for much of his career, even though he had sponsored.
But early on, he
sponsored gun control legislation when he was in the legislature. Right. A waiting period, which was unheard of in Nevada, and it didn't pass. But he changed, and you can say it was pragmatism. You can say it was purely political, but he changed and became a darling of the NRA until the 2010 election, when he felt that the NRA betrayed him by promising him an endorsement, then not, and doing a no endorsement in a very contentious race with Sharon Angle, whom he eventually defeated. So, but he had an A+ rating from the NRA. That the NRA executives came to Vegas and talked glowingly about Harry Reid, which, can you imagine them doing that about any Democrat these days? No, of course not.
Yeah.
Immigration was even more stark in some ways. Some of the speeches he gave, and I quote from them in the book, in the early 90s, sound like Donald Trump or Ted Cruz or someone like that. Today, he was against birthright citizenship. He said they're taking American jobs. And he was against the so-called Reagan amnesty bill in 1986. But then Nevada began to change. Which is one thing. The Hispanic population, there wasn't even a Hispanic population when Reid first got into politics. But now it started to grow a lot, and you could see that his views changed as the Hispanic population, which is now more than a quarter of the population.
Powerful voting bloc,
very powerful voting. Mm-hmm. But there was something more to it than that too. Landra was very upset with his positions, and he recounted on one night he came home after one of these speeches, and Landra let him have it, saying her parents probably had come to this country illegally and from Eastern Europe, and so I think she had an influence on him on that too. And then he got to know some of the Dreamers and became a big supporter of Dreamers and DACA. And he actually brought up the DREAM Act during that contentious 2010 race when all of his advisors were saying, don't do this, it's going to hurt you. He says, I don't care, it's the right thing to do. He developed a very close relationship with a woman by the name of Astrid Silva, who became maybe the most famous dreamer in America because he brought her to the Democratic National Convention. She appeared on stage with Barack Obama. And so that was not the Harry Reid of the early 90s that you saw in the era of Obama.
Right. And of course, by that time, LDS church leaders were endorsing Dreamers. Of course, it was the first public position Russell Nelson took.
That's right.
After he became president. Yeah.
So what position caused him the most opposition from fellow Mormons? There's that one chapter.
I think it was abortion. I really do. And the first race I covered of Harry Reid's was his first race for the Senate in 1986. In which it was the first time that the Mormon community was divided. Usually they had supported Reid, but by then he'd become more of a partisan, and it was more partisan than religious at that point. And some of his friends and campaign supporters who were Mormon were very upset that he was being criticized within the Mormon church. And there was a schism. There was a real schism. I remember writing about it as a young cub reporter, first covering politics when I didn't even know what Mormonism was. And so that became a real issue for him then and going forward. And it became really, really ugly. There were leaflets on his car when he did events. When they did, trunk or treat, events that the church did. They would put leaflets on his car. They portrayed him as the devil. It became really ugly and very painful for his friends. Reid had a pretty thick skin about this stuff, but it was upsetting to his family. It was upsetting to Landra when all of this stuff happened. And it was very, very bitter up until the end.
Wasn't there something in 1998 where he said something about a Supreme Court? He would just go with the Supreme Court, whatever they said. And then there was some opposition.
There was a very conservative group, Mormon dominated group that unendorsed him because that, and he tried to change his statement, but they said it's too late. You're never getting our endorsement. Again, in that 1998 race that you're referring to was a very, very close race with a congressman by the name of John Ensign, and he almost lost that race. It was about a 400 vote race. There's some people still to this day, and I raised some questions about it in the book about whether he actually won that race because the recount was short circuited by the Secretary of State at the time.
They stopped it.
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's fast forward. During the 2012 campaign, the Mormon moment, in some respects, he accused Mitt Romney without any real evidence of not paying taxes like for more than a decade, 12 years or something. Talk about how this came about, this allegation came about.
It's really something. And what's really even more amazing about it, and I will tell you the genesis of it, is that he never regretted it. In fact, he
said even until his death, almost.
And even until his death, his only regret, he said, in public life was voting for the Iraq War, nothing else. And, he still said the same thing to me that he said to Dana Bash in the famous CNN interview afterwards. Well, Mitt Romney lost, didn't he? Ends justify the means, right? But he had been told this apparently by John Huntsman Sr. that something about Romney not paying his taxes. Now the story changed. First, it was he didn't pay his taxes for 10 years. Then he never paid his taxes.
He didn't pay the right amount, fair share or whatever.
Right. And so he went to the campaign, the Obama campaign in the White House and the DNC and said, you've got to say this. And they didn't want any part of it because, of course, Reid couldn't prove it. It was hearsay. And his staff said, please don't say this out loud. It's going to cause a lot of problems. But, of course, Reid, who was hard to contain and, as I like to say, had no self-editing mechanism, as most politicians do, at one point with a twinkle in his eye at the end of an interview with a couple of political reporters, just blurted it out. Hey, did you know that Mitt Romney didn't pay his taxes? Of course, that became the lead of their story and it became a sensation. He repeated it on the Senate floor of all places. And he never could prove it. And what was really interesting, I found another great find in the archive, which was a treasure trove, is that his staff became so worried about this that they decided that what if Romney says Reid should release his tax returns? Reid was very wealthy by then, mostly from land ownership in southern Nevada. And they looked and they found out that his tax rate was much lower than probably should have been. And they said, well, if they say you have to release your taxes, you're probably going to have to release them. And he looked at this tax rate and said, I'm not doing that. And then
he was concerned a little bit about tithing that he was contributing to the church.
Oh, right? I don't think it was that much. I mean, that was in there too. And he was concerned a little bit about that, but he was much more concerned about the tax rate.
Oh, absolutely.
And there were some other, maybe you call them anomalies that his staff thought might be used against him. But of course, they also thought that they had the response, well, Harry Reid's not running for president. Why should he release his tax returns? Now, Romney never asked for Reid to release his tax returns. But if they had, that would have really been something.
Oh, okay. This is probably a dumb question. What was his relationship with Romney?
So here's the thing about Harry Reid is, and you mentioned early in this interview about his hardscrabble roots. Mm-hmm. And he worked very hard to get where he was. And he thought Mitt Romney was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. And
landed at third base. Yep. Yeah, exactly.
And he did not like people like that, whether it was Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney was not the only one. George W. Bush, he thought the same thing of him. The Koch brothers, he thought the same thing of them. So he just had no respect for them. And so, I interviewed Mitt Romney during that campaign. Ironically, by the way, the next event after his interview with me for my TV show was to go to the Trump Hotel and get endorsed by Donald Trump, which was a fun interview with Romney when I asked him, why would you take this endorsement? But he he did not like Romney, and of course Romney did not like him, and I'm sure Ann Romney didn't like Harry Reid either. But there was a famous attempt at rapprochement after the campaign. I actually I had to cut a lot out of my original manuscript. I had to cut this part out, but McKay Coppins writes about it in his biography of Romney, and Reid never really apologized to Romney, but he thought there should be a meeting. It was brokered by Mike Levitt, I believe, and so their relationship ended up being all right. And Romney was the kind of guy who, he was more of a let bygones be bygones kind of guy than Reid was, for instance. When one of his staffers said, "Vengeance is in my soul," he said to him once. So they were very different guys, but I think Romney probably had more forgiveness in his heart than Reid deserved for that.
Yeah.
So how did President Obama get along with Harry Reid?
Obama loved Reid, and Reid loved Obama. They didn't always get along, and sometimes Reid thought that Obama should stay out of his legislative business. Let me pass this for you. I don't want to hear from Rahm Emanuel or anybody else about his chief of staff about tactics. Just let me do it. This is my bailiwick. And, Obama, I did an interview with him too, which was great that he agreed to do that. And he gave Reid all the credit in the world for passing Obamacare. And without Reid, it never would have gotten passed. Pelosi did a lot too, of course, Nancy Pelosi, but she had an easier time in the House than Reid had in the Senate because he had to get 60 votes. Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. But Obama gave a eulogy for Reid at his funeral that was really moving, and I quote a little bit from it in the book. I thought really captured who Harry Reid really, really was. But they couldn't have been more different. But Harry Reid was just so taken by Obama when he came to the Senate, and what a gifted orator he was, and he told Obama to run for president. I think Obama was already thinking about running for president, but Obama got out of there and called David Axelrod, his close advisor, and said, "Harry Reid just told me to run for president." And Axelrod told me, I don't think that was the deciding factor, but when you think about it, it didn't hurt to know that the highest ranking Democrat in Congress said that you should run. And of course, that was probably news to Hillary Clinton, who tried to soft pedal it when I interviewed her for the book about Reid. But as Reid said to me, something along the lines of, "I loved the Clintons, but this was Obama's time and I knew it."
Okay. What do you think most observers get wrong about Harry Reid?
I think they get wrong. I think people paint him in one dimensions, and that's the one dimension, and that's the story of today more than anything else, is that he was this hopeless partisan hack who had no regard for any other human being and would do anything to win. Now, part of that is true, but there was another side to him. I mentioned Landra and that love affair, but he was also incredibly kind to his staff. Even and I've never met. I know a lot of his staffers over the years. I interviewed a lot of them for the book. Never seen any group of people more loyal than Harry Reid's staff was. I mean, one story that I tell is one staffer who was hired early in her career to just take down phone numbers and give them to Reid. And he kept calling these numbers and they were the wrong number. And he called her into his office and she thought she was going to get fired. And he looked at her and said, "You have an issue, don't you?" And she said, "Yeah, I'm dyslexic. I should have." And she thought the next words were, "You're fired." His next words were, "It must be so much harder for you to get where you've gotten than most people. Just keep trying." So there was a kinder, gentler side to Harry Reid that I don't think people knew. And probably he thinks that I didn't talk about enough when I wrote columns about him.
Well, speaking of that, how did you and Reid get along? Did you like him? Did he like you?
I think there was a mutual respect. Now, we had a roller coaster of a relationship. He didn't talk to me for a couple of years in the 1990s after I wrote a column that he urged me not to write about him taking honoraria. And he said, "I'm not going to talk to you ever again. If you write the column." I did. And then 2 years later, he summoned me to his office and said, "I'm ready to talk to you again." And I said, "You may have noticed, Senator, over the last 2 years, I continued to write about you. So who do you think lost in this equation?" then when I wrote columns in the early 2000s and later about him using his influence to help his sons, including help his son get a job as the city attorney of Henderson, he thought that was attacking his family. I think more Landra thought that. And so he would not come on my TV program. And he tried to get me fired from jobs, that he was that kind of guy. And he eventually did succeed. Another document I found in the archive and celebrated my getting me fired from my last television program. But nevertheless, I still wanted to write the book about him because I knew to Harry Reid it was just business. It wasn't personal. And he probably done that to countless other people, by the way, those kinds of things. But I just found him so fascinating, the duality of the guy that we've touched on already. And, when he finally summoned me to his office, which, of course, where do all former senators have offices once they were on the Bellagio on the Las Vegas Strip? And he summoned me there and said, I want you to write the book. It was never about what you wrote about me. It was about my family. I assume that you're not going to attack my family in the book. I won't like everything you write, but I want you to do it. You're the right guy to do it. Took a lot of people close to him lobbying him for a long time, saying, Ralston knows you better than anybody. You should let him tell the true story of Harry Reid. He'd written an autobiography, but it was very hagiographic, as all autobiographies are, I guess, but even more so with his, glossed over a lot of things. And so I'm actually very sad that he passed away before the book was published, because I would have liked to have known what he thought about it. And believe me, while some people may be insincere how they feel about the book, he wouldn't have been. He would have told me whether he liked it or not. He would have given
you an honest review, right?
He would have. He definitely would have.
Well, the name of the book, again, is The Game Changer, How Harry Reid Remade the Rules and Showed Democrats How to Fight. Jon Ralston, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to Peggy Fletcher Stack.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind our listeners that they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.